This baby grows a fur-like hair around bears. His body adapts to family. The morning mist hung low over the forest, thick and white like a blanket that refused to lift. Ethan Marshall stood on the wooden porch of their cabin, coffee mug warming his hands, watching the trees disappear into that soft gray nothing. Something felt different today. The birds that usually sang their morning chorus were silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He heard Lily stirring inside, their 3-month-old son Jacob making those soft baby sounds that still filled him with wonder. They had moved here 2 months ago, seeking peace after years in the city, wanting their child to grow up surrounded by nature instead of concrete. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Montana, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by ancient pines that whispered secrets in languages older than memory. Lily appeared beside him, Jacob cradled in her arms, his tiny fingers reaching toward the forest as if he could grasp the mist itself. "He's been restless all morning," she said softly, adjusting the blue blanket around their son. "Keeps turning toward the woods like something's calling him." Ethan took a sip of his coffee and noticed how Jacob's eyes, usually baby blue and wandering, seemed focused on something beyond the tree line. The baby made a sound, not quite a cry, more like a hum that vibrated deep in his little chest. That's when they saw it. A shadow moving through the mist, too large to be a deer, too graceful to be anything but alive and aware. Then another shadow joined it, and another, until 5 massive shapes emerged from the fog like ancient spirits taking form. Bears. 5 black bears, their fur glistening with morning dew, stood at the edge of their property. But they weren't acting like bears should act. There was no aggression in their posture, no threat in their movement. They simply stood there, watching, their dark eyes fixed not on Ethan or Lily, but on Jacob. The baby's humming grew louder, a strange melody that seemed to echo through the morning air, and the largest bear, a female with a distinctive white patch on her chest, took a step forward. Lily instinctively pulled Jacob closer, but the bear stopped, lowered her massive head, and made a sound that mirrored Jacob's hum. It was impossible, yet it was happening. Their 3-month-old son and this wild creature were somehow communicating. "Should we go inside?" Lily whispered, though her feet seemed rooted to the porch. Ethan couldn't move either. There was something in the air, something electric and ancient that made his skin tingle. The bears remained still, patient, as if waiting for permission. Jacob reached his tiny arms toward them, his humming becoming almost joyful, and that's when Ethan noticed it. At first, he thought it was just the morning light playing tricks, but as he looked closer at his son's exposed arms, he saw something that made his breath catch. Fine, downy hair, softer than anything that should grow on human skin, was spreading across Jacob's forearms. It wasn't the typical baby hair that some infants have. This was different, thicker, with a texture that caught the light in a way that reminded him of fur. The discovery should have terrified them, should have sent them running to the nearest hospital, but something about the bear's presence, their calm watchfulness, made everything feel strangely right. Lily noticed it too, her gasp quiet but sharp. She traced her finger along Jacob's arm, feeling the soft growth that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The bears seemed to sense their discovery, and the female with the white patch made another sound, deeper this time, almost reassuring. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they turned and melted back into the forest, leaving the family standing on the porch with 1,000 questions and no answers. Days passed, and the fur-like hair on Jacob's arms grew more pronounced. It would appear strongest in the early morning and late evening, times when the bears were most active in the surrounding woods. Ethan spent hours researching online, looking for medical conditions, genetic anomalies, anything that could explain what was happening to their son. But every search led to dead ends or conditions that didn't quite fit. Jacob wasn't sick. In fact, he seemed healthier than ever, his eyes bright and alert, his movements strong for a baby his age. The pediatrician in town during their scheduled checkup found nothing wrong, though Ethan and Lily carefully covered Jacob's arms with long sleeves, not ready to share this impossible secret. The bears returned every morning, always maintaining a respectful distance, always focused on Jacob. Lily started keeping a journal, documenting every change, every interaction. She noticed patterns that defied explanation. When the bears were near, Jacob's fur would shimmer and grow slightly longer. When they were gone for more than a day, it would recede, though never completely disappearing. The baby's sounds were changing too, developing into complex patterns that seemed to mean something, at least to the bears. One morning, the female with the white patch brought something in her mouth, setting it gently at the edge of the porch before retreating. It was a pine cone, perfectly intact, somehow feeling like a gift. Ethan's rational mind struggled with what his eyes were seeing. He was a software engineer, a man who believed in code and logic, cause and effect. But here in these woods, those rules seemed to bend. He started leaving his laptop closed, spending more time watching, observing, trying to understand. The bears never threatened them, never came too close without what felt like invitation. They were guardians, he realized, though guardians of what, he couldn't say. Jacob would laugh when they appeared, a sound so pure and joyful that it made Ethan's chest tight with emotion. This was their son's normal, his reality, and who were they to say it was wrong? One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lily sat on the porch with Jacob while Ethan prepared dinner inside. The bears had been particularly active that day, and Jacob's fur was more visible than ever, now covering not just his arms but spreading up to his shoulders and down his back in soft, barely visible waves. She should have been frightened, should have been making emergency calls to specialists, but instead she felt a strange peace. Jacob was cooing happily, his sounds mixing with the evening bird songs when she heard something that made her heart skip. If you enjoyed this mysterious beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more incredible stories like this one. Your support helps us share these amazing tales with others who love the unexplained wonders of our world. The largest bear was approaching, closer than ever before, and in the fading light Lily could see something she hadn't noticed before. Around the bear's neck, barely visible through the thick fur, was a marking. Not a scar, but something that looked almost like a pattern, a design that seemed deliberate. The bear stopped just feet from the porch, her dark eyes meeting Lily's, and in that moment, something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. The bear's eyes weren't wild or empty. They held intelligence, purpose, and something that looked impossibly like compassion. Jacob reached toward the creature, making his humming sound, and the bear responded with a similar tone, their voices creating a harmony that sent shivers down Lily's spine. That night, after Jacob was asleep in his crib, Ethan and Lily sat together in their small living room, the fire crackling in the fireplace. They didn't speak for a long time, both processing what their life had become. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "What if this is why we were meant to come here?" he said quietly. "What if what if he's something special?" Lily leaned into him, feeling the weight of that possibility. They had wanted a quiet life in the woods, away from the chaos of the city. They had gotten that, but also so much more. Their son was changing, adapting, becoming something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. The changes in Jacob accelerated over the next weeks. The fur-like hair would now respond to his emotions, bristling slightly when he was upset, lying smooth when he was content. It was still soft, still barely noticeable unless you looked closely, but it was undeniably there. More remarkable were the sounds he made. While other babies his age were just beginning to babble, Jacob was creating complex vocalizations that seemed to have meaning. The bears always understood, responding with their own sounds, creating conversations that Ethan and Lily could only watch in wonder. The female with the white patch, whom Lily had started calling Luna in her journal, became a constant presence, often sleeping just beyond the tree line where they could see her massive form in the moonlight. One morning brought a new development that shook their already tilted world. Ethan woke to find Jacob's crib empty, the window open, cool morning air drifting in. Panic seized him until he heard Lily calling from outside. He rushed to the porch to find a scene that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. Jacob was on the grass, crawling with more coordination than any 4-month-old should have, moving toward where Luna sat waiting. The bear was perfectly still, watching the babies approach with what could only be described as patience. Lily stood nearby, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't moving to stop it. Something in the air, in the moment, told them both that this was meant to happen. Jacob reached Luna and placed his tiny hand on the bear's massive paw. The size difference was absurd, the baby's entire hand smaller than one of the bear's claws, yet there was no danger here. Luna lowered her great head, sniffing Jacob gently, and made a sound so soft it was almost a purr. The baby laughed, that pure, innocent sound echoing through the morning forest, and his fur shimmered in the early sunlight. Then Luna did something that defied every nature documentary Ethan had ever watched. She lay down, her massive body creating a protective curve around Jacob, and the baby curled against her fur as naturally as he would against his mother. They stayed like that for an hour, Ethan and Lily watching from the porch, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Other bears emerged from the forest during that time, 4 of them, all sitting at respectful distances, all watching Jacob with those intelligent eyes. It was a gathering, Ethan realized, though for what purpose he couldn't fathom. When Jacob finally grew tired and fussy, Luna carefully stood and stepped back, allowing Lily to collect their son. The bear watched them return to the cabin, then turned and led her companions back into the forest. That night, Jacob slept more peacefully than he had in weeks, and the fur on his body seemed to pulse gently with each breath, as if it were alive with its own purpose. The town was 40 minutes away, and they went only when necessary, for supplies and Jacob's checkups. They had become masters of disguise, dressing Jacob in long sleeves and pants even on warm days, explaining to curious locals that he had sensitive skin. But children have a way of revealing secrets, and Jacob's differences were becoming harder to hide. His development was accelerated in some ways, his physical coordination and apparent understanding far beyond his months. Yet in other ways he was perfectly normal, laughing at peekaboo and crying when hungry. The pediatrician, Dr. Sarah Chen, noticed his advanced development but attributed it to good genetics and the healthy mountain air. If she noticed anything else, she kept it to herself, though her eyes sometimes lingered on Jacob with a curiosity that made Ethan nervous. One day, while Lily was in town getting groceries, she overheard 2 old-timers talking at the general store. They spoke in hushed tones about the old stories, the legends their grandparents had told about the first settlers in these mountains. Stories about children born between two worlds, bridges between human and nature, guardians of ancient pacts that modern people had forgotten. She wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but the description they gave of children who could speak to the forest, who grew fur like morning frost, who were protected by the bears, made her hands shake as she loaded her groceries. When she got home and told Ethan, they both sat in silence, wondering if Jacob was part of something much older and larger than they could understand. The seasons began to change, summer giving way to early autumn, and with it came new changes in Jacob. His fur adapted to the temperature, growing thicker as the days cooled, lighter in color to match the changing forest. He was crawling everywhere now, often toward the windows where he would sit and hum his complex songs to the woods beyond. The bears were teaching him, they realized, though teaching him what remained a mystery. Luna would often sit just outside, visible from the window, and make sounds that Jacob would mimic. It was language lessons of a sort, though in a language no human linguist would recognize. Sometimes other forest animals would approach when Jacob was outside, deer and rabbits showing none of their usual fear, birds landing nearby to listen to his songs. Ethan started working from home exclusively, unable to leave his family during this strange time. His company was understanding, happy to have him remote as long as the work got done. But focusing on code and debugging was becoming increasingly difficult when his son was outside communing with bears, when his wife was documenting impossible changes in their child, when the very fabric of reality seemed to be shifting around them. He found himself thinking about evolution, about adaptation, about the stories of feral children raised by wolves. But Jacob wasn't being raised by bears. He had loving human parents. He was just also something else. One particularly memorable morning, Jacob spoke his first word. Not mama or dada as they had expected, but a sound that wasn't quite human, a deep rumble that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat. Luna, who had been resting near the tree line, immediately responded with an identical sound. It was a word, Ethan realized with a shock, just not in any human language. Jacob laughed at Luna's response and made the sound again, and this time 2 other bears answered from different parts of the forest. Their son had spoken his first word, and it had been in bear. Lily cried that day, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that their son was bilingual in a way no child had ever been before. The fur on Jacob's body had developed into a beautiful pattern by his 6th month. It was still soft and fine, but it grew in swirls and waves that reminded Ethan of wind patterns or water currents. In certain lights it seemed to shimmer with colors that weren't quite there, browns and golds and silvers that shifted with his mood. When he was happy, which was often, it would lie smooth and seem to glow with health. When he was upset, it would bristle slightly, making him look like a tiny, adorable hedgehog. The bears could read these changes from a distance, often appearing when Jacob was distressed. Their presence alone enough to calm him. Dr. Chen finally confronted them during Jacob's 6-month checkup. She had noticed the unusual hair growth despite their efforts to hide it, and her medical curiosity wouldn't let her ignore it. But instead of the alarm they expected, she showed them an old medical journal from her grandfather, who had been a doctor in these same mountains decades ago. In it were notes about 3 cases of children with similar conditions, all from families who lived deep in the forest, all showing unusual hair growth and advanced development. The children had grown up healthy and normal, she said, though they had all remained in the mountains their whole lives. Some things, she said carefully, don't need explaining, they just need accepting. She never reported anything unusual about Jacob, and they never forgot her kindness. The first snow came early that year. October bringing white blankets that transformed the forest into a winter wonderland. Jacob's fur responded immediately, growing thicker and taking on a slight white tinge at the tips, perfect camouflage for the snowy landscape. He was pulling himself up now, not quite walking but close, and his vocalizations had become incredibly complex. Ethan had started recording them, thinking maybe someday a linguist could make sense of them, but he doubted any academic would believe their origin. The bears were less visible in the snow, but their tracks were everywhere. Circles of protection around the cabin, paths worn from their constant vigilance. One snowy evening, as they sat by the fire with Jacob playing on a blanket, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. It was singing, or something like it, coming from the forest. Multiple voices, deep and resonant, creating a harmony that seemed impossible. They wrapped Jacob in warm clothes and stepped onto the porch to find 7 bears arranged in a semicircle in their yard, their heads tilted back, creating music that defied explanation. Jacob immediately joined in, his small voice adding a higher note to their chorus, and the sound that resulted was so beautiful that Lily found herself crying. It went on for 10 minutes, this impossible concert, before the bears fell silent and disappeared back into the snowy woods. That night, Jacob's fur seemed to pulse with its own light, a soft bioluminescence that faded by morning. The winter months brought a routine of sorts. The bears would visit daily, always maintaining their respectful distance unless invited closer. Jacob learned to walk during a January blizzard, taking his first steps not toward his parents but toward Luna, who waited patiently in the snow. His balance was perfect, his movements sure, as if walking was something he had always known how to do. The fur on his body had become his natural insulation, keeping him warm even in the coldest weather. They still dressed him in normal clothes when they went to town, but at home he often wore just a diaper and a t-shirt, comfortable in temperatures that made his parents bundle up. Lily's journal had become a detailed record of their new reality. She documented every change, every interaction, every impossible moment. She wrote about how Jacob seemed to know when storms were coming, growing restless hours before the weather changed. She wrote about how he could find things in the forest that should have been impossible for a baby to locate, like the specific mushrooms that Luna would eat, or the hidden streams where the bears would fish. She wrote about the night they woke to find Jacob's crib empty again, only to discover him outside in the moonlight, surrounded by not just bears but deer, rabbits, and even a fox, all sitting peacefully together as if attending some sort of forest parliament with their son at the center. Spring arrived with dramatic force, the snow melting rapidly and filling the streams with rushing water. Jacob's fur adapted again, becoming lighter, the thick winter coat shedding to reveal the finer, more colorful pattern beneath. He was walking confidently now, often wandering to the edge of the porch to call for his bear friends. His human words were developing, too. Mama and Dada finally making their appearance, though they were interspersed with the rumbles and hums that only the forest understood. He was truly bilingual, switching between human and bear communication as easily as breathing. The day everything changed again came in late April. Jacob was playing in the yard while Ethan worked on his laptop on the porch, and Lily tended her small garden. Luna appeared from the forest, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked another bear, massive and scarred, older than any they had seen before. But it wasn't just a bear. Around its neck was something that made Ethan's laptop slip from his fingers. It was wearing a necklace, ancient and worn, made of stones and what looked like carved bone. The bear's eyes were different too, holding an intelligence that went beyond animal, something almost human in their depth. This ancient bear approached slowly, each step deliberate, until it stood before Jacob. The baby, just over a year old now, stood perfectly still, showing no fear. The old bear lowered its massive head until it was eye level with Jacob, and then it spoke. Not in growls or rumbles, but in words, ancient and accented but unmistakably human language. "Little guardian," it said, its voice like distant thunder, "you have come at last." Lily dropped her gardening tools, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan stood frozen, his rational mind finally completely shattered. The bear continued. "We have waited generations for one like you, one who could bridge our worlds again." The old bear, who introduced himself with a name that sounded like Tethys, though spoken with overtones no human throat could reproduce, told them a story that should have been impossible. Long ago, he said, humans and the forest guardians, what humans called bears but were something more, had lived in harmony. Some humans were born with the gift, the ability to change, to adapt, to speak the old languages. They were the bridge keepers, ensuring peace between the worlds. But as humans forgot the old ways, built cities, and lost their connection to the forest, the bridge keepers disappeared. The guardians had waited, keeping the old knowledge alive, hoping one would be born again. Jacob was that one, the first in over 100 years. Tethys explained that Jacob's fur wasn't just hair, but a manifestation of his connection to the forest itself. It would allow him to survive in the wild, to communicate with all forest creatures, to understand the language of trees and streams. He would grow up human, but also more than human, able to walk between worlds. The bears weren't just watching him, they were protecting him, teaching him, preparing him for a role that Ethan and Lily were only beginning to understand. It was overwhelming, impossible, and yet, looking at their son standing confidently before this ancient, speaking bear, they couldn't deny the truth of it. "But he's just a baby," Lily said, her voice shaking. "He should have a normal childhood, go to school, make friends." Tethys turned his ancient eyes to her, and in them she saw centuries of wisdom. "He will have all of that," the old bear said gently, "but he will also have more. He will have the forest as his classroom, the animals as his friends, and a purpose greater than most humans ever know. You are not losing your son. You are raising a guardian, a protector of both worlds." The bear touched his nose gently to Jacob's hand, and the baby laughed, that pure sound that had always seemed to bring joy to every creature that heard it. Over the following days, Tethys visited regularly, always with Luna and the others, creating what Ethan started thinking of as Jacob's forest school. They would sit in a circle, these massive bears and one tiny human child, and Tethys would make sounds that Jacob would repeat. But it wasn't just language they were teaching. Jacob was learning to read the forest itself, to understand the subtle signs that indicated weather changes, predator movements, and seasonal shifts. His fur would respond to these lessons, patterns shifting and changing as if recording the information in its very structure. Lily struggled with the reality of their situation more than Ethan. Her maternal instincts wanted to protect Jacob from this strange destiny, to give him a normal life. But watching him with the bears, seeing the joy in his eyes, the perfect ease with which he moved between human and forest life, she began to understand that normal was a relative concept. Their son was happy, healthy, and loved by not just his human parents but by an entire forest community. The bears brought gifts, teaching tools of sorts, interesting stones, special plants, things that helped Jacob understand his world better. Their cabin became a meeting place between worlds, and slowly, Lily found peace with it. The town noticed changes too, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what was different. The forest around the Marshall cabin seemed healthier, more vibrant. Wildlife sightings increased, but there were no negative encounters. Hikers reported feeling an unusual sense of peace in those woods, as if something was watching over them. Dr. Chen visited once, not for medical reasons but out of curiosity, and when she saw Jacob playing with Luna in the yard, his fur visible and shimmering in the sunlight, she simply smiled. "My grandfather would have loved to see this," she said quietly. "He always believed the old stories were true." Summer brought new challenges and revelations. Jacob's verbal skills were developing rapidly in both languages. He could speak simple sentences in English, but his bare language had become incredibly sophisticated. Ethan watched in amazement as his son held what appeared to be complex conversations with Tethys, the sounds they made varying in pitch, tone, and rhythm like any human language. The fur patterns on Jacob's body had become even more intricate, and they discovered they could actually change color slightly, helping him blend into different environments. In the deep forest, they would take on greenish-brown hues. In the meadows, golden tones would emerge. One day in July, something extraordinary happened even by their new standards. Jacob was playing near the stream that ran behind their cabin when he suddenly stopped and placed his hands on the ground. His fur bristled and shimmered, and he made a sound they had never heard before, high and urgent. Within minutes, every bear in the area had arrived, along with numerous deer, rabbits, and birds. They all seemed agitated, and Tethys immediately began leading them higher up the mountain. He paused only to say one word to Ethan and Lily. "Come." They grabbed emergency supplies and followed, Jacob riding on Ethan's shoulders. An hour later, from their vantage point high on the mountain, they watched a flash flood tear through the valley where their cabin sat. Jacob had somehow sensed it coming and warned everyone. Their home was damaged but not destroyed, and no creature was harmed. The flood changed things in the town, too. People wanted to know how the Marshalls had known to evacuate, how they had gotten so lucky. Ethan and Lily kept their explanations vague, mentioning animal behavior and instinct, but rumors started spreading. Some of the old-timers began telling the ancient stories more openly, speaking of the bridge keepers and the guardians. A few brave souls even ventured to the Marshall cabin with offerings for the bears, leaving food and handmade gifts at the forest edge. The bears never showed themselves to these visitors, but the gifts would disappear, and sometimes something would be left in return, a perfect pine cone, an unusual stone, a feather from a rare bird. As autumn approached again, Jacob was speaking in full sentences in both languages. His fur had developed into its full glory, a magnificent coat that could shift and change with his needs and emotions. He looked like a normal toddler from a distance, but up close, the differences were unmistakable. His eyes held depths that seemed ancient. His movements were too graceful, too sure, and of course there was the fur, beautiful and impossible. He played like any child, laughed like any child, but he also sat in council with bears, sang songs that made the birds fall silent to listen, and knew things about the forest that no child should know. Tethys began teaching Jacob about his future responsibilities. There would come a time, the old bear explained, when Jacob would need to help other bridge keepers emerge. They were out there, dormant, waiting for someone to show them it was safe to be what they were. Jacob's role wasn't just to bridge the human and forest worlds, but to awaken others who carried the gift. It was a heavy burden for such a young child, but Jacob seemed to understand instinctively, nodding solemnly when Tethys spoke of these things. His parents could only watch and support, understanding that their son's path was unlike any they could have imagined. One evening, as the first snows of Jacob's second winter began to fall, The family sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the bears gather in their yard. It had become a nightly ritual, this gathering, a checking in between worlds. Jacob sat between his parents, his fur thick and warm against the cold, humming one of his forest songs. Luna approached, as she often did now, close enough to touch. Jacob reached out and placed his small hand on her massive paw, and she made a sound that could only be described as a bear's version of a lullaby. In that moment, Ethan understood something profound. They weren't raising a child who was part human and part something else. They were raising a child who was fully both, complete in each world, divided by nothing. The winter passed with Jacob growing stronger in both his human and guardian abilities. He learned to read simple books, but also learned to read the stars the way the bears did, navigation by instinct and ancient knowledge. He played with blocks and toys, but also played with living creatures who treated him as one of their own. His fur became even more responsive, sometimes forming patterns that seemed to tell stories, ancient tales that Tethys would recognize and explain. The old bear was teaching Jacob the history of the Guardians, stories passed down through generations of forest dwellers, never written but never forgotten. Spring brought visitors from the university, researchers who had heard rumors and come to investigate. Ethan and Lily were careful, keeping Jacob inside, his fur hidden under clothes, but the researchers were persistent. They set up cameras in the forest, hoping to capture evidence of the unusual bear behavior. What they captured instead was something that made them pack up and leave within days, refusing to say what they had seen. The footage, Tethys later told them with what seemed like amusement, showed the bears standing on their hind legs in a circle, creating patterns in the snow that hurt to look at. Optical illusions that suggested dimensions beyond the three humans were comfortable with. The message was clear. This forest kept its secrets. As Jacob approached his third birthday, his abilities had become even more pronounced. He could now partially control his fur, making it lie completely flat when they went to town, though it took effort and tired him out. He was bilingual in the truest sense, often translating between his parents and the bears, helping them understand each other better. His connection to the forest had deepened to the point where he could feel the health of trees, the paths of underground water, the migrations of birds he had never seen. He was becoming what Tethys had promised, a bridge between worlds, and his parents were learning to bridge those worlds with him. The birthday party was unlike any other. They invited no human children, knowing it would be impossible to explain. Instead, the forest itself came to celebrate. Bears, deer, rabbits, foxes, even a family of raccoons attended, gathering in their yard in peaceful coexistence. Jacob stood in the center, his fur shimmering with joy, speaking words of thanks in both his languages. Lily had made a cake, which Jacob shared with his parents while the animals enjoyed special treats they had prepared. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Tethys stood and spoke in his ancient voice. 3 years old in human time, he said, but already ancient in wisdom, the bridge grows stronger. That night, after all the forest guests had returned to their homes, the Marshall family sat together in their living room. Jacob was curled between his parents, his fur soft against their skin, already half asleep. They had traveled so far from their original plan of a quiet life in the woods. They had discovered wonders they never could have imagined, faced challenges that no parenting book could have prepared them for. Their son was something unprecedented in the modern world, a bridge between the human and natural worlds, a guardian of ancient packs and future possibilities. As Jacob slept, his fur gently pulsing with his dreams, Ethan and Lily held each other and their impossible, wonderful child, knowing that their journey was just beginning. Sekou chapters of Part 1 have completed. The cave appeared in their lives the way all the significant moments had, with the bears leading the way. It was a humid morning in late July, Jacob now 3.5 years old, his fur adapting to the summer heat by becoming incredibly fine, almost invisible unless the light caught it just right. Luna had appeared at dawn, making urgent sounds that Jacob immediately understood. "She wants us to follow," he told his parents, his voice clear and certain. "Something important." They had learned to trust these moments, so they packed water and snacks and followed Luna into the deeper forest, places they had never ventured before. The journey took 2 hours, winding through sections of forest that seemed untouched by human presence. Ancient trees towered above them, their canopies so thick that the forest floor was in perpetual twilight. Jacob walked confidently, his bare feet finding purchase on moss and stone with supernatural ease, his fur helping him sense changes in temperature and air pressure that guided his steps. Other bears joined them along the way, until they were a procession of 7 bears and 3 humans, moving with purpose through the green shadows. Ethan noticed that even the usual forest sounds had faded, replaced by a deep quiet that felt expectant, waiting. The cave mouth was hidden behind a waterfall, the entrance so perfectly concealed that they would never have found it without the bears' guidance. The water parted strangely as they approached, as if recognizing their right to enter, and they found themselves in a vast cavern that should have been dark but wasn't. The walls themselves seemed to emit a soft, phosphorescent glow, revealing paintings that made Lily gasp and grab Ethan's hand. The images were ancient but perfectly preserved, showing humans and bears together, but not as they were now. In these paintings, the humans had fur like Jacob's, and the bears stood upright, their paws shaped differently, more like hands. They were working together, building, teaching, living as equals. Tethys was already there, standing before the largest painting, which showed a gathering of hundreds, humans and bears together under a full moon. "This was the time of unity," he said, his ancient voice echoing in the cavern, "when your kind and mine were not separate, but one people with different forms. The bridge keepers were many then, and the world was in balance." Jacob approached the wall, his small hand reaching out to touch the images, and when he did, his fur responded, creating patterns that matched those in the paintings. It was like watching a key find its lock, a recognition that went beyond memory into something coded in his very being. The paintings told a story that unfolded as they moved deeper into the cave. They showed the gradual separation, humans choosing cities and technology, bears retreating to the forests, the bridge keepers becoming fewer with each generation. There were images of the last gathering, perhaps 200 years ago, when only 3 bridge keepers remained. The final painting showed a single child, fur-covered and surrounded by bears, with words written in a script that hurt to look at directly. Tethys translated, "When the world forgets how to speak, one will come who remembers both languages. The bridge will be rebuilt, and the peoples will remember their kinship." Jacob stood transfixed before this final image, his young face serious beyond his years. "That's me, isn't it?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Tethys nodded slowly. "You are the first in so long, little guardian, but you will not be the last. Others sleep, waiting for your call to awaken." The old bear moved to another section of the cave, where natural shelves in the rock held objects that seemed impossible, tools that were both primitive and sophisticated, books made of materials that weren't quite paper, crystals that hummed with their own frequency. "These are the teachings," Tethys explained. preserved for when they would be needed again. They spent the entire day in the cave, Jacob absorbing information in ways his parents couldn't fully understand. He would touch an object and know things, his fur creating patterns that seemed to be a form of writing, recording what he learned. Tethys and the other bears would add their own knowledge, speaking in their ancient language, and Jacob would translate fragments for his parents. They learned about the old agreements, the ways humans and forest guardians had shared resources, protected each other, maintained the balance. They learned about other bridge keepers who had existed, their stories preserved in the bears' oral traditions and now passed to Jacob. One section of the cave held what Tethys called the memory pool, a natural depression filled with water so still it looked like glass. When Jacob looked into it, images appeared, not reflections but memories, showing bridge keepers from centuries past. His parents saw them too, these impossible children and adults who were both human and more. Their fur-covered bodies moving through history, always working to maintain connections that the modern world had forgotten. Some of the images were joyful, showing celebrations and cooperation. Others were heartbreaking, showing the last bridge keepers dying alone, their knowledge almost lost, saved only by the bears who remembered. As the day wore on, Jacob began to change in subtle ways. His fur patterns became more complex, incorporating designs they had seen in the cave paintings. His eyes seemed deeper, older, carrying knowledge that no 3-year-old should possess. But he was still their son, still the little boy who laughed at silly jokes and wanted bedtime stories. The duality of his existence had never been more apparent. He was a child and an ancient soul, human and guardian, bridge and traveler all at once. Watching him, Lily felt a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that his path would be beautiful but never easy. The journey back from the cave was quiet, everyone processing what they had seen and learned. The bears surrounded them protectively, and Ethan noticed that other forest creatures were watching from the shadows, all aware that something significant had happened. When they finally reached their cabin as the sun was setting, Jacob was exhausted, his fur lying flat against his skin, his eyes heavy. But before he would go to bed, he insisted on sitting with his parents and telling them what he had understood, translating the knowledge from sensation and instinct into words they could grasp. "The bears remember everything," he said, his small voice serious. "Every bridge keeper, every agreement, every time the world's touched. They've been waiting, keeping the knowledge safe, like a library made of memory instead of books. And now I'm supposed to help everyone remember. Not just the bears in the forest, but humans too. We've forgotten that we're all connected, all part of the same big family. My fur isn't making me different. It's showing what we all are underneath, connected to everything." His parents listened, amazed at the wisdom coming from their toddler, understanding that he was translating concepts that human language could barely contain. That night, Jacob's dreams were vivid and strange, and his fur glowed softly in the darkness, creating patterns that shifted and changed like living art. Lily and Ethan took turns watching him, unable to sleep themselves, their minds full of cave paintings and impossible histories. They had thought they were raising a special child, but they were beginning to understand they were raising a revolutionary, someone who would challenge the very foundations of how humans saw their relationship with the natural world. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The days following the cave visit brought new developments. Jacob began teaching his parents the bear language in earnest, helping them understand the nuances of tone and rhythm that carried meaning. It was incredibly complex, involving not just sound but body position, scent markers that humans could barely detect, and something Jacob called forest feeling, an emotional resonance that connected all living things. Ethan, with his engineering background, tried to map it like a programming language, but it defied logical structure. It was more like music, improvisational and alive, changing with context and emotion. Luna became an even more constant presence, often spending entire days near the cabin. She and Jacob would have long conversations that his parents could now partially follow. They discussed the health of the forest, the movements of other animals, the weather patterns that were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Climate change, Luna communicated through Jacob, was something the forest felt deeply, a disruption in patterns that had existed for millennia. The bridge keepers of old had helped maintain balance, and without them, the world was losing its way. Jacob's role wasn't just about connection, it was about healing, bringing back an equilibrium that had been lost. Dr. Chen visited again, this time bringing her elderly father, who had insisted on coming when she told him about Jacob. The old man, in his 90s, took one look at Jacob playing with Luna in the yard and began crying. He spoke in Mandarin, which Dr. E. Chen translated. "My grandmother told me stories of the fur children, the ones who spoke for the forest. Everyone said she was crazy, but I knew she was telling the truth. They existed in China, too, long ago before the forests were cut down." He approached Jacob slowly, respectfully, and the boy seemed to recognize something in him, speaking a greeting in bear language that the old man somehow understood, nodding and responding with a sound that wasn't quite human. The old man shared his grandmother's stories, tales of children born with fur who could heal sick forests, who knew where to find water in droughts, who could calm wild animals and negotiate between human villages and nature. They were called different names in different cultures, but they were all bridge keepers, maintaining harmony between worlds. Most cultures had these stories, he said, but modern people had dismissed them as mythology. Seeing Jacob, seeing the truth of it, gave him peace he had been seeking his entire life. Before he left, he gave Jacob a small jade pendant, ancient and worn, carved with symbols that matched some of the patterns in Jacob's fur. As summer turned to autumn, Jacob's abilities continued to evolve. He could now consciously control his fur to a remarkable degree, making it change color to match his surroundings so perfectly that he could become nearly invisible in the forest. It was camouflage, but also more than that. When he merged with the forest this way, he could feel everything, every root system, every underground stream, every creature moving through the undergrowth. It was overwhelming at first, and he would come back from these experiences exhausted and disoriented. But with practice and the bear's guidance, he learned to filter the information, to touch the forest's consciousness without losing himself in it. The town was beginning to change its attitude toward the Marshall family. The old stories, once whispered, were now being told openly. People would leave offerings at the forest edge, not for the bears specifically, but for the forest itself, acknowledging a presence they had long ignored. Some claimed to have seen Jacob in his full glory, fur shimmering as he moved through the trees with his bear companions, though Ethan and Lily were careful to neither confirm nor deny these sightings. The local newspaper ran a piece on the historical legends of the area, carefully avoiding any mention of current events but laying groundwork for acceptance of possibilities beyond the ordinary. One night in October, something unprecedented happened. Jacob woke his parents just after midnight, his fur bristling with excitement. "Someone's coming," he said, "another one like me." They followed him outside to find the bears already assembled, all facing the same direction, waiting. From the darkness emerged a family, a couple with a young girl about Jacob's age. The child's arms were covered in fine, silver-white fur that caught the moonlight like spun silk. The parents looked exhausted, frightened, but also hopeful. "We heard the stories," the mother said, her voice shaking. "We drove for 3 days. Please, can you help us understand what's happening to our daughter?" The girl's name was Savannah, and she had been developing fur for 6 months. Her parents, Michael and Jessica Hayes, had been terrified, taking her to dozens of doctors who could find nothing wrong. They had been about to commit her for observation when Michael's grandmother had told them about the old stories and the rumors coming from a small town in Montana. Watching Savannah and Jacob meet was like watching two halves of something reconnect. They didn't speak at first, just stood looking at each other, their fur creating complementary patterns. Then Jacob reached out his hand, and when Savannah took it, both children's fur began to glow softly, a warm light that seemed to come from within. The bears reacted to Savannah the same way they had to Jacob, with recognition and welcome. Luna approached the girl slowly, gently, and Savannah showed no fear, reaching out to touch the bear's face with a confidence that made her parents gasp. "She's been trying to talk to animals for months," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "We thought she was just playing, but the animals, they respond to her. Birds land on her hands, squirrels bring her nuts, and last week a deer walked right up to our back door and wouldn't leave until Savannah came out to see it." Tethys arrived an hour later, drawn by some signal only the bears could perceive. He studied Savannah carefully, then spoke in his ancient voice. "The awakening has begun. 1 became 2, and 2 will become many. The bridge is rebuilding itself." He explained to the Hayes family what he had told the Marshalls, about the bridge keepers and their role, about the connection between humans and nature that had been severed but never truly broken. Michael and Jessica listened with a mix of disbelief and relief, finally having an explanation for their daughter's transformation, even if that explanation challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Over the next days, the two families bonded as only those sharing an impossible experience could. Jacob and Savannah were inseparable, teaching each other, their different types of fur creating a visual harmony when they played together. Jacob's earth-toned patterns complemented Savannah's silver-white coloring perfectly. They would sit for hours with the bears, learning together, their young voices joining in the ancient songs. Savannah's fur, they discovered, had different properties than Jacob's. While his helped him blend with the forest, hers seemed to reflect and amplify light, creating an aurora-like effect in darkness. Together, they were like the earth and sky aspects of the same power. The Hayes family decided to stay, renting a cabin not far from the Marshalls. Michael worked remotely like Ethan, and Jessica, who was a teacher, began homeschooling both children along with regular lessons from Tethys and the bears. It was an unconventional education, mixing traditional academics with forest wisdom, human language with bear communication, modern knowledge with ancient understanding. The children thrived, their development accelerating in ways that continued to amaze their parents. They were learning not just facts, but ways of being, how to exist in multiple worlds simultaneously. The presence of 2 Bridgekeeper children changed the forest's energy noticeably. Plants grew more vibrantly, water ran clearer, and animals that had been scarce for years began returning. The bears told them, through the children's translations, that this had always been the way. Bridgekeepers didn't just connect worlds, they healed them, their very presence restoring balance that modern life had disrupted. Jacob and Savannah would often join their fur patterns together, creating a combined effect that seemed to pulse with life, sending ripples of vitality through the forest around them. Word of the 2 children spread despite the family's attempts at privacy. They began receiving letters, emails, and even visitors, parents with children showing similar signs, researchers wanting to study the phenomenon, journalists seeking stories. They turned almost everyone away, but occasionally, when Jacob and Savannah both felt it was right, they would meet with a family whose child was beginning to manifest fur. By winter, they had identified 3 more children across the country, showing signs of being bridge keepers, though none as advanced as Jacob and Savannah. The winter solstice brought another gathering in the cave, this time with both children and all the bears. The cave painting seemed brighter with 2 bridge keepers present, and new sections of the cave opened that had been sealed before, revealing more history, more tools, more knowledge. Savannah discovered she had an affinity for the crystal objects, which would sing in harmony with her silver fur, creating sounds that could heal minor injuries and calm distressed animals. Jacob's connection was to the organic materials, the wooden tools that would warm in his hands and reveal their purposes through touch. As they explored deeper into the cave, they found a chamber that took their breath away. It was a library of sorts, but instead of books, it contained what looked like frozen moments in time. Crystalline structures that held memories and knowledge from bridge keepers throughout history. When Jacob and Savannah touched them together, the memories would play out like 3-dimensional movies. Showing them scenes from hundreds of years ago, they saw great gatherings of bridge keepers and forest guardians, saw the treaties being made between humans and nature, saw the slow decline as the industrial age drove the worlds apart. One crystal showed them something that made even Tethys grow quiet with reverence. It was a prophecy of sorts, or perhaps a memory of the future, showing dozens of bridge keeper children standing together, their various fur patterns creating a tapestry of connection that spanned continents. The image showed the world itself beginning to heal, forests regenerating, waters clearing, the climate stabilizing. It wasn't a promise but a possibility, a future that could exist if the bridge keepers returned in sufficient numbers and humans remembered their connection to the natural world. The families spent Christmas together, a celebration that mixed human traditions with forest customs the bears taught them. They decorated a living tree with objects from the forest, each one significant to the animals that had brought them. Jacob and Savannah sang carols in English and bear language, their voices creating harmonies that drew wildlife from miles around to listen. Even the falling snow seemed to respond to their singing, creating patterns in the air that looked almost like dancing. It was magical in the truest sense, not the magic of fantasy, but the magic of connection, of worlds touching and recognizing each other. As the new year began, changes were accelerating. More children were being identified as potential bridge keepers, their fur beginning to manifest in various forms and colors. Some had scales instead of fur, connecting them to rivers and water life. Others had feathers, linking them to the sky and birds. Each was unique, but all shared the same fundamental ability to bridge human and natural worlds. Tethys explained that this diversity had always existed among bridge keepers, each one connecting to different aspects of nature, together forming a complete web of communication and understanding. The scientific community was beginning to take notice, though most still dismissed the reports as hoaxes or mass hysteria. But a few brave researchers came with open minds, and when they saw Jacob and Savannah with their own eyes, saw the bears responding to the children's words, saw the fur that was absolutely real and absolutely impossible, they left changed. One geneticist spent a week with them and left saying only that everything she thought she knew about human evolution needed to be reconsidered. She never published her findings, but she did start quietly reaching out to families with unusual children, offering support and connection rather than study. By spring, the Marshall and Hayes families had become the unofficial center of a growing community. They established a foundation, carefully worded to avoid too much attention, that provided support for families with uniquely gifted children. They created a network for sharing information and resources, helping parents understand and accept their children's transformations. Dr. Chen became their medical advisor, documenting the children's health and development. Finding that Bridge Keeper children were remarkably healthy, resistant to most diseases, and healed from injuries faster than normal. The Bears, through Jacob and Savannah, began teaching more complex lessons about the interconnectedness of all life. They explained how the Bridge Keeper's fur wasn't just an adaptation, but a physical manifestation of the connections that existed between all living things. Every pattern in their fur represented a relationship, a line of communication between species. When Bridge Keepers were present and active, these connections strengthened, allowing for better cooperation, healthier ecosystems, and more resilient natural communities. The children were literally weaving the world back together with their presence. One day in May, a government official arrived, someone high enough in the system to be taken seriously, but open-minded enough to listen. She had come not to study or expose, but to understand. Her own daughter had begun showing signs, and she needed to know what this meant for the future. After spending 3 days with the families, watching the children interact with the bears, seeing the cave and its ancient knowledge, she left with a promise to protect them, to create bureaucratic shields that would keep them safe from those who might want to exploit or harm them. She understood that this wasn't just about a few special children. It was about humanity's future relationship with the planet. As Jacob approached his 4th birthday and Savannah neared the same age, their abilities had become truly remarkable. They could now fully communicate with any animal they encountered, understanding not just bears but birds, insects, even the fish in the streams. Their fur had become so responsive that it could create complex patterns that were essentially visual languages, allowing them to communicate concepts that had no words in any human language. When they worked together, they could sense disturbances in the forest from miles away, knew when animals were sick or injured, when water sources were contaminated, when the balance was off. The birthday celebration that year included not just the 2 families and the bears, but representatives from 7 other families with Bridge Keeper children. The gathering looked like something from the cave paintings. Humans and animals together in harmony, children with fur, scales, and feathers playing alongside normal human children who were siblings or friends. The parents, who had all gone through the shock and confusion of their children's transformations, supported each other with understanding that no one else could provide. They were pioneers in a new kind of parenting, raising children who were rewriting the rules of what it meant to be human. Tethys, ancient and wise, stood before the gathering as the sun set, casting long shadows through the forest. "This is how it begins again," he said, his voice carrying to every ear. Not with grand announcements or scientific revelations, but with children playing, families accepting, communities forming. The bridge rebuilds itself one connection at a time, one friendship, one moment of understanding. You are living the reunion of worlds that were never meant to be separated. His words carried the weight of centuries, but also hope for the future. That night, as the family settled into sleep, the forest itself seemed to pulse with contentment. The bears kept watch as they always did, but their vigilance was peaceful, protective rather than defensive. Inside the cabins, children with fur, scales, and feathers slept beside their human parents, their bodies adapting to serve as bridges between worlds. Jacob and Savannah, in their respective homes, dreamed the same dream of a great gathering yet to come, where hundreds of bridge keepers would stand together, healing the ancient rift between humanity and nature. The seasons continued their cycle, each bringing new developments, new children awakening to their bridgekeeper nature, new understanding of what this meant for the world. The Marshall and Hayes families had become the guardians of something precious and revolutionary, a return to a way of being that the modern world had forgotten but desperately needed to remember. Their children were not mutations or anomalies, but remembrances. Their fur and scales and feathers, external signs of connections that had always existed, but had been ignored for too long. As summer approached again, bringing with it the anniversary of Jacob's first encounter with the bears, the families reflected on how far they had come. From terror and confusion to acceptance and wonder, from isolation to community, from thinking their children were afflicted to understanding they were gifted. The bridgekeepers were returning, one child at a time, and with them came hope for a future where humans and nature were not separate but united, where the ancient agreements could be renewed, where the world could remember how to speak all its languages again. The story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. More children would awaken, more families would join their community, more bridges would be built between worlds. There would be challenges. Those who would fear or try to exploit what they didn't understand. But there would also be wonder, healing, and connection beyond what most humans had thought possible. The bears knew this, had always known it, had kept the faith through generations of waiting. Now, with Jacob's fur shimmering in the morning sun, and Savannah's silver patterns catching the light like moonbeams, with more children awakening every day, the waiting was over. The bridgekeepers had returned, and the world would never be the same.